You are listening to Parliament Matters, a Hansard Society production supported by the Joseph Rowntree Charitable Trust. Learn more at hansardsociety.org.uk/pm.
Welcome to Parliament Matters, the podcast about the institution at the heart of our democracy, Parliament itself. I'm Ruth Fox.
And I'm Mark Darcy, and coming up in this week's episode...
The sentencing mess. How the government got into a tangle about new criminal sentencing guidelines and how it plans to untangle it.
A matter of privilege. Is heavy-handed policing interfering in the work of MPs?
And after a 25-hour speech brought the US Senate to a halt, could it ever happen at Westminster?
And Ruth, let's begin by talking about, as you described it, the sentencing mess. The Sentencing Council, the independent arm's-length body which to some extent has had outsourced to it the policy on how many years tariff there should be for a particular offender who's committed a particular crime, all sorts of issues of sentencing procedure, has basically landed the government in a very difficult position. It's supposed to be an arm's-length body, but it's now recommended something that's very, very uncomfortable for a government.
Yes, so what essentially it's done, it has to consult on its guidelines periodically. It held its consultation at the end of 2023, beginning of 2024. At the time, it was sort of passed over politically, both by the government and by the opposition. Nobody really raised any questions about it.
Because this surfaced actually when the Conservatives were still in government.
Yes.
Well, at least the consultation process was taking place and a Conservative minister to some extent signed off on it in a rather perfunctory way. And now it's landed in the lap of their successors in the Labour government.
Yeah, and essentially this is quite an extensive consultation document that they've produced, but it's at the heart of this political problem is the element of the new guidance which deals with pre-sentencing reports. And essentially what the government and the opposition are concerned about is that it singles out differential treatment of ethnic minority offenders when ordering pre-sentencing reports, which then the judges would use to make their decisions on sentencing. Now, the argument is this is going to lead to a two-tier system in which ethnic minority offenders, have these pre-sentencing reports but wouldn't necessarily have them for white offenders. Conversely, the argument is, well, we already have a two-tier justice system and sentencing system because all the evidence shows that white offenders are less likely to get an immediate custodial sentence or a longer custodial sentence than ethnic minority offenders. So this is a part of the balancing process.
You can see exactly how the Sentencing Council got into this position. And incidentally, this is largely something composed of judges from the various different levels of the criminal justice system and magistrates, and a few lay advisors of one sort or another as well. So you can see how it would have got into this position and has tried to do a bit of rebalancing. But you've ended up with something that's very, very politically toxic.
Yeah, and I think it's important to stress this is not about the Sentencing Council saying to judges, you've got to hand down lighter sentences. It's simply about that you can order a pre-sentencing report to better understand the circumstances of the offender. Just important, I think, to set the parameters of that.
But the argument, I suppose, then is that leads on possibly to lighter sentences.
Yes. We know Robert Jenrick, the shadow opposition spokesperson, of course, was a member of the last government, very frustrated with the way the justice system is working, although a lot of these issues and problems were developed on his government's watch. He raised it a few weeks ago. At the time in government, the then Conservative minister did not raise any concerns. The government is consulted by the Sentencing Council on this. The Justice Committee in the House of Commons was consulted, didn't raise concerns about it. But all of a sudden it's become, because of this campaign, a political hot potato. The Justice Minister, Shabana Mahmood, very clear she doesn't want what she's described as two-tier sentencing.
Yeah, but she got rebuffed when she said that to the sentencing panel.
So her response was, well, we're going to legislate to stop this and we'll have emergency legislation if necessary. She's published this week a bill to do just that. And that obviously has persuaded the Sentencing Council that, in fact, they should delay implementation of their guidance.
And just wait for the legislation to kick in. Yeah. So we've got the Sentencing Guidelines Pre-Sentence Report Bill 2025.
Indeed.
Will be debated by MPs after they come back from their Easter break. And it's not quite emergency legislation because it's not being whacked through in a single day, but it's going through in a reasonably fast track.
Yes, so this is one of the things that's my bugbear, because politicians and the media, I'm sorry, Mark, the media, they often bandy around this concept of emergency legislation. If it was genuine emergency legislation, it would be going through yesterday, today. It would be on a very, very fast track. And sometimes bills do. If you've got to respond to a court case, for example, or there's a national security issue, or, you can put a bill through very, very quickly, drafted almost overnight. And this is a very short bill, I think a couple of clauses. So,
yeah, it's a very short bill indeed. It just basically says the Sentencing Council can't do what it wants to do on this.
But what it is going to be is what we would call fast track or expedited legislation, in that if it was an emergency bill, it would happen today.
Warp speed, basically.
Warp speed. If it's fast tracked, it would go through all its stages in a day, second reading through to third reading in the Commons. Now, there have been 150 bills that have done that since 1979, so it wouldn't be unusual. But actually, it's going to be slightly slower than fast track because it's going to have its second reading immediately after Easter, and then the following week it'll have its committee report stage, third reading. So basically 2 weeks after Easter, it will have gone through its common stages, and then it'll be kicked into the Lords. So it will mean that best practice around decent intervals of time between each stage won't happen.
Yeah, I mean, there is that problem with it, but it is, as you say, a very short bill. The urgency has been slightly drained out of the issue by the Sentencing Council pausing the implementation of these guidelines to give Parliament time to legislate. Yeah. So they don't have to act to stop new sentencing guidelines coming in immediately. Yeah. Otherwise, it probably would have had to have been emergency legislation, but it's all been a bit more civilised than that. I could predict that there will be a bit of fun when this hits the House of Lords. I think all the sort of massively senior ex-law lords and ex-Supreme Court judges and ex-judges who sit in the House of Lords will not be entirely amused by this, and will be a bit worried about possibly the end of arm's length determination of sentencing policy.
No, well, when the minister in the Lords, it was the Prisons Minister, Lord Timpson, delivered the same statement that Shabana Mahmood had delivered in the Commons announcing this, it was very notable the number of eminent lawyers who rose to express concerns on all sides of the House, including some Labour peers as well. But the one that did amuse me was Lord Phillips of Worth Matravers, who'd been former head of the Sentencing Guidelines Council, which is the predecessor body of this particular Sentencing Council. But yes, that's where the expertise is.
Yeah, well, absolutely. So there might be a little bit of fun. Who knows, there might even be ping-pong on this bill, which would keep us all entertained. But I think one of the points to watch on this is the genesis of all this. How did the government get into this mess in the first place? And my long-term theory of what's been going on in this country for a decade plus now, possibly since 2008, is that British government has been bouncing from one crisis to another. In 2008, you had the financial crisis, and that reverberated through the ensuing 4 or 5 years, causing austerity, amongst other things. 2016, we get Brexit, and the run-up to the Brexit referendum had begun a couple of years before that, really. You then had Brexit dominating politics, bringing down prime ministers at regular intervals for some years after that. And then just as we managed to get a breath after the Brexit deal had been done, COVID hit, and you had a couple of years of COVID crisis. And then again, barely drawing breath, you're into the energy crisis occasioned by the vast rise in global energy prices caused by Russia's invasion of Ukraine. So it's been one crisis after another, and a great deal of bread and butter governance has fallen by the wayside, both because there's an overriding crisis and because of the kind of governmental churn, the constant change in prime ministers and therefore in cabinets and therefore in ministers. The revolving doors in and out of government meant that a lot of stuff just wasn't getting the attention it would otherwise have had.
Yeah. I think there's also a question about where people's political antennae is directed.
Yeah.
So both ministers, special advisors supporting those ministers, there's churn there as well. Do officials know what it is that ministers want in respect of these policies when, you know, they're directed to keep an eye on what they're doing? There's sort of arm's length, there's oversight. Ministers have representatives on some of these bodies, but do those representatives really know what it is that their ministers want from them or their departments want from them?
And you do suspect, actually, that if you had a minister who was facing a challenge from reform rather than, say, from the Liberal Democrats, they might be rather more alive to the politics of this kind of process than appears to have been the case, shall we say delicately.
And also interesting that when it was a Conservative minister, you might have thought they'd have been alive to this kind of issue, but evidently the then Conservative minister at the time, Gareth Bacon, it passed through his officials, presumably past his special advisors, past his desk. He signed off on it, presumably thought it was okay and didn't spot the elephant trap.
Maybe they're all busy looking at the impending general election Gotterdammerung that was visibly ahead of them. But there's also a legislative side to this. I mean, the fashion for outsourcing difficult areas of government policy to semi-independent or supposedly independent bodies, I think, is something that's been going on for quite a while now. You saw it with NHS England, although the idea that closing a hospital would suddenly not lead to politicians being blamed because it was NHS England and not ministers making the decision was always, I think, a complete illusion. Similarly with sentencing policy. When people are unhappy with sentencing policy, they're not going to say, oh, it's all determined by an independent body of judges.
Yeah.
They're going to say, ministers, do something.
Yeah. And essentially, if you go back to sort of this sentencing council set up in 2009, so this is a decision initially taken by Jack Straw when he was Justice Secretary. And again, to bring some coherence to sentencing guidelines. It was in response to various independent reviews and official working groups and bodies that made these recommendations from the judiciary themselves. But it's interesting if you look at the sort of back history on this. 1998, so very early in the Labour administration, they set up the Sentencing Advisory Panel in the Crime and Disorder Act. 5 years later, they're setting up the Sentencing Guidelines Council in the Criminal Justice Act. 4 years later, they're having a review of prisons to look at the advantages of a permanent sentencing commission for England and Wales. And this is all tied up with the debate about prison places and the cost of prison spaces and so on. 2009 then, you get the Coroners and Justice Bill, in which this structured sentencing body that we're now dealing with the after effects of is established in the Coroners and Justice Act.
And of course this was a bill that was going through in the dying days of Gordon Brown's Labour government and possibly wasn't getting quite as much attention as it might have deserved. I mean, when we're talking about these pieces of legislation, they're all singing, all dancing giant pieces of multi-purpose Home Office legislation which tweak the criminal law here, reform coroners' courts there, do lots of other things and often have 20 different prime purposes within them.
Yeah, I mean, that bill that set up the Sentencing Council was, if ever there was one, a Christmas tree bill. It had lots and lots of policy baubles hanging off its various arms and branches.
Such a lovely expression.
Everything from, as you say, the coroner's system, freedom of information, there was Commissioner for Victims and Witnesses, security of the courts, provision on legal aid. I mean, the short title was very, very long. One, you've got the problem that you're constantly legislating, which we know in the sort of home affairs and the justice area has been a constant problem. Regular legislation every few years. And
sort of sedimentary layers, and half of any given criminal justice bill is correcting the mistakes in the previous one.
So nothing sort of settles for very long. But then you've got the problem, you have a very, very big bill like this one, with lots of provisions, quite different in character, all scrutinised together in one job lot. And it's more difficult for MPs and peers in terms of where they focus their attention. Yes, the Sentencing Council issue was raised. There was a brief discussion of it at second reading in the debate back in 2009, for example, but it perhaps didn't get the kind of focus that it might have had if it had been a slimmer, smaller, more focused bill.
So if there'd been the Sentencing Council brackets establishment bill and people had then looked at the powers and abilities and the parameters in which this organisation would work, it might have been a much more focused effort. And you might, as a result, not have gone into the elephant trap that it subsequently blundered into.
Yes, and back in 2009, a lot of the focus ended up being on other provisions because the bill got into a complete procedural tangle in the House of Lords, amending the bill around secret inquests in sensitive cases. They got into a whole mess about including new amendments to make provisions for this, but then didn't deal with the consequential amendments later in the bill. So they'd got sections of a bill that they were proposing to send to the House of Commons about a provision that they'd taken out. And it ended up this huge procedural debate about how on earth you then remove them, because Clark said it can't be done at third reading in the House of Lords, and can it be done at ping pong, because that's about resolving differences between the two houses. It's not about removing mistakes. They eventually resolved it, but up against, prorogation was heading, end of the session was heading in the direction of the bill. It had been going on for months. So all of these issues mean that things get lost, and it highlights the problems, I think, of scrutiny of legislation.
Yeah, some 15 years later, here we stand with problems perhaps that might have been avoided if there'd been more focus at the time on what a sentencing council was going to do.
And one of the things that they could have focused on, but didn't, interestingly, was what is the role of Parliament in relation to this body. So at the time, in 2009, Alan Beath asked the question, should the role of the council be subject to scrutiny by Parliament?
I think he was at the time the chair of the Justice Committee, wasn't
he? He might have been, I'm not sure. But
sorry, it's in the subsequent Parliament.
Okay. But yes, he's had a long-standing interest in these matters. So you raised the question, what's Parliament's role here? And Jack Straw indicated there had been a discussion about whether Parliament should have to approve these guidelines by the affirmative order, essentially requiring both houses of Parliament to debate them and to approve them. And he said there would be many objections to that. Now, interestingly, he didn't articulate.
Didn't detail them.
No, he didn't articulate what those objections would be, and didn't seem to be challenged on it in the second reading debate. So we never got that provision for Parliament having a role here, that it might have highlighted these issues if it had to come to a debate, and might have avoided the problems. Interestingly, in other aspects of the bill, they did make provision for Parliament having to approve things, but not on this. And again, you ask why? What's
you'd
the
have thought
difference?
sentencing policy was a pretty important issue for Parliament to be distanced from.
Yeah, so all that Parliament got on the sentencing guidelines was that the Justice Committee is a statutory consultee. And of course, they were consulted and didn't see any problem.
And here we are.
Well,
with that, Ruth, shall we take a quick break?
Let's do that. See you in a minute.
Bye. And we're back, and Ruth, let's talk about another area where perhaps officiousness has become a problem for members of Parliament, and this is the police investigation into comments made on a parent's WhatsApp about the appointment of a teacher in a primary school, and what seemed to flow from it, which was that local elected representatives, up to and possibly including local MPs, were basically being warned off intervening on behalf of parents who'd been arrested by police over comments that had been made on a WhatsApp forum. And there is a general thought here that maybe the police are getting a bit too concerned with policing nasty things or even innocuous things that are said online, and possibly are not concerned enough with bread and butter policing about boring stuff like crime. But it gets particularly toxic when it impinges on the work of elected representatives who are told that they should keep their distance from something that's surely their job.
Yeah, I'd missed this, Mark, until you actually pointed it out to me in the Sunday Times story this weekend. I'd completely missed it. But this is the story of the two parents who seemingly got arrested by 6 police officers, held in a cell overnight by my own police force, Hertfordshire Constabulary, thank you for that. And the local elected representatives, I think both local councillors and the MP, Sir Oliver Dowden, former Deputy Prime Minister, no less. Not an insignificant figure. They got involved, obviously, and were looking into it. And what seems to have happened is that a police officer seems to have told a local councillor via email, who was asking questions about this case and had copied in Oliver Dowden and others, that if they didn't stop asking questions about it and cease communications on the issue, they might find themselves liable to being recorded as a suspect in a harassment investigation. Which is pretty extraordinary. And understandably, Oliver Dowden has basically said, well, first of all, you've got police overreach here. And secondly, this is a curtailment of democracy. I'm quite entitled to ask questions on behalf of my constituents about what on earth the police are doing.
This gave me a little bit of a flashback to a case some years ago now where the Conservative MP in one of the Worthing seats, Tim Lawton, at the time, he's not there anymore, got into a spat with a constituent, one of these chronic correspondents that a lot of MPs have, people who are constantly firing in angry letters, demanding this, demanding that, turning up at the surgery, haranguing the MP, and it's often something that the MP either can't do anything about or is something completely illusory. I mean, I'm pretty sure most MPs have someone who fits this kind of description.
Oh, yes. I can imagine all the parliamentary staff listening to this podcast have now got in their mind's eye exactly who their constituent is in their particular case.
Strays to a bulging file of correspondence. But Tim Lawton in this case got quite irate and made a speech in the Commons about how he had sacked this person as his constituent. He was so sick of the constant correspondence that he's basically saying that he's not going to deal with him anymore, and he sent a Hansard of this to the constituent, who then complained to the police, who then interviewed Mr. Lawton. So what had been a, dare I say it, slightly silly spat suddenly escalated into something where the Sussex Constabulary were wandering along to talk to an elected member of Parliament about his relationship with, or non-relationship with, a constituent. Tim Lawton was sufficiently unhappy that he actually referred this to the Commons Privileges Committee, who very quickly decided that the act of an MP sending a Hansard of a Commons debate to a constituent was covered by parliamentary privilege, and that the police's action in this case had been a contempt of Parliament. And I well remember going along to the Privileges Committee hearing in which the Chief Constable of Sussex took a hell of a thrashing.
And we should probably explain to listeners that when we sort of talk about parliamentary privilege, what we mean. So essentially it grants some legal immunities to MPs.
Yeah.
To enable them basically to perform their duties without interference.
Speaking freely in the chamber is probably the biggest of these, in the sense that you can't be prosecuted for libel for something said inside the Commons or at a committee, a number of other sort of Commons-related contexts. But at the same time, there's also, as you say, the ability of an MP to do their job. There's also a right for unimpeded access to the buildings of Parliament itself. So there's a whole load of things covered by parliamentary privilege. But the idea that the police should get involved in something to do with the correspondence between an MP and one of their constituents is actually quite alarming. And I don't think there was a great deal of sympathy for the Sussex Constabulary in Parliament over this, because it was just the most extraordinary overreach.
No, well, I don't think there's an awful lot of sympathy for Hertfordshire Constabulary also, who have some form. And I think the Chief Constable himself has basically admitted that they probably could and should have handled it better. We should say that the parents in this case, the police have concluded there's no case to answer. There's no case to be pursued. But nonetheless, it raises lots of questions about what the role of the MP is. How do you deal with these kinds of cases? And frankly, what the ability of organisations like schools and others is to deal with potentially, it might have been vexatious correspondence. It might have been, excessive. But lots of organisations, lots of public bodies have to deal with that, and you can't keep calling in the police every time you don't like it.
It's a bit going nuclear, isn't it? I think a lot of schools have parental WhatsApp groups where teachers are discussed, perhaps in ways that those teachers don't particularly like, but I'm afraid that's show business. You've got to put up with it.
Well, I think the lesson here is just get off WhatsApp. Can we tariff it?
A very good life lesson there, I think. Meanwhile, Ruth, it's been a very, very busy week on the committee corridor. I mean, it's pretty humdrum in the main chamber, but on the committee corridor there have been 2 whole hearings of the Treasury Committee dedicated to looking at the intricacies of Rachel Reeves's spring statement. We were talking about it last week. And the Treasury Committee had, first of all, the usual panel of experts, Paul Johnson making his now traditional and possibly constitutionally required appearance before the Treasury
Probably
Committee.
His last one, isn't it?
Yeah, quite possibly his last one, because he's going off to run Oxford College, I think. But he was there, and a whole load of other experts from the OBR, the Office for Budget Responsibility, were there as well, teeing up the following day, on Wednesday, an appearance by Rachel Reeves herself. And the weirdness of this occasion is that it rather reminded me of the day that Boris Johnson, on the final day of his premiership, was in front of the liaison committee solemnly discussing policies that he was never going to actually implement. In this case, you had Rachel Reeves solemnly discussing a budget that had been completely upended by Donald Trump's big tariff announcement. I suppose it's the way of Western democracy now, that you have world trade government by narcissistic episode. Up gets the President of the United States and announces something, and all previous calculations are therefore inoperative. So all of Rachel Reeves' carefully calculated X billion pounds of headroom have been completely upended by the slap that's been given to UK industry by these tariffs, 25% on cars, 10% on everything else. Wham.
Yeah, I didn't see it. Was the discussion actually in the committee about tariffs, or was that just sort of off to
Well,
the
of course,
side?
it was before the announcement had been made.
But we knew it was
well,
coming.
we knew it was coming. We didn't know quite what was coming. We didn't know that the UK was going to get a 10% tariff and everybody else was going to get 20% or more. So there was that side of it. But it was essentially Rachel Reeves issuing a plea for calm and saying the government would keep a cool head and react to whatever emerged, because, of course, the government didn't know what was going to be announced. Apparently half the White House didn't know what was going to be announced either. So they just had to sort of wait and see.
Yeah. The committee is chaired by
Dame
Meg
Meg
Hillier,
Hillier,
Dame
yeah.
Meg Hillier. And of course, the committees now are so dominated by Labour members. Did they give her a real grilling? Because that's the question I think a lot of us have got an eye on is, how is it going to work with Labour ministers in very difficult circumstances at the minute, being grilled by select committees that are so heavily dominated by Labour members?
It wasn't that great. I think at the moment, new Labour MPs are still a little bit diffident about giving ministers, particularly senior ministers like the Chancellor, who's the most senior minister other than the Prime Minister, a bit of a grilling. So I think that's going to wait. I think the other side of it is, I think Rachel Reeves is one of those very highly evolved politicians who somewhere in the course of their evolution has developed a blowhole which enables them to inhale while still talking. And she just talks and talks and talks and talks and talks, and there's never a gap to leap into.
Yeah.
In the way that when you're dealing with Treasury mandarins, for example, there's usually sort of well-spaced pauses in their answers to questions which allow people to leap in. With Rachel Reeves, just the word stream, if you like, is such that it's actually quite difficult to interrupt her.
Interesting. And I understand the Transport Committee also gave a grilling to representatives from Heathrow and the National Grid about the the disaster at Heathrow Airport a couple of weeks ago.
They had the chief executive of Heathrow in there, and he gave a very, very abject apology right at the start of proceedings. I mean, Ruth Cadbury, the chair of the Transport Committee, another Labour MP, just pointed out at the beginning that something like 200,000 to 300,000 passengers had their journeys disrupted, possibly cancelled altogether, by the power outage that crippled Heathrow for a while. So in that context, this guy began with an apology. I haven't seen anything quite like it since the masters of the banking universe had to come in one by one in 2 sessions, I think, of the Treasury Committee at the time, back in 2008, and apologise. And this was at that level of abject apology. And then there was a discussion of why it was that there was this sort of point failure possibility. One substation goes out and Heathrow has to close, when Heathrow is actually supplied with power from 3 electricity substations, but apparently elaborate cross-wiring had to take place before another one of them could fill the gap. So there was something very odd about the way the whole system was configured, and it wasn't very resilient, and I think that point sunk home pretty hard.
Yeah, I didn't catch those, Mark, but I did catch a session of the Modernisation Committee. This is the committee that's been established under the leadership of the Leader of the House of Commons, Lucy Powell, and they had a session with a group of current and former MPs who have some form of disability to talk about the access of Parliament, both as a building and also its procedures around things like voting, and actually just the length of time you have to sit in the chamber to get called to speak.
Yeah, so we were talking about that with Marie Tidball, a Labour MP, last week, because she'd been lobbying very hard on this issue, and indeed she featured.
Yeah, she was one of the MPs, former MP for Harlow, whose office she now occupies. Robert Halfon was also there. There was the Liberal Democrat MP who's blind and has a guide dog. The dog is called Jenny.
Who has her own Twitter feed, incidentally.
Yeah, so that's Steve Darling MP. And then also Marcia de Cordova, who is a Labour MP who's registered blind, partially blind, and Sarah Bull MP, who has type 1 diabetes. And it was just really interesting. Some of them obviously have physical disabilities, some have sight disabilities, some of them have health conditions that affect their ability to move around the estate or to spend extensive periods of time in the chamber without access to food and drink and so on. But it was an absolutely fascinating insight into how they experience the palace and the building and the process in ways that are different to somebody like ourselves who's able-bodied. I mean, I found Marcia de Cordova's account of moving about the building when you're partially sighted, as she is, you're registered blind. It's things like In the lifts, you don't know what floor you're on because you and I know they're very small lifts. This is this historic palace, very small lifts. They're very dark, all wood panelling, very difficult to see anyway. If you do have good sight, absolutely hopeless if you don't. And she was saying, you just need audio to announce what floor you're on.
So you need a voice saying third floor.
Third floor, yeah.
Well, in common speak, of course, it would be principal floor,
yes.
Committee corridor.
Yeah, which I'm not sure helps.
Committee corridor.
If you're a new MP, I'm not sure that would be very helpful. But there was an absolutely cracking story where she said that in the office block next to the palace, the more modern part of the building, Portcullis House, as you and I know, it's a lot of glass panelling, glass walls, glass doors. And she said if you've got a sight problem, you can't necessarily see where the door is. And she'd sort of taken some officials round and suggested that one very quick, easy solution would be to put some coloured labels on the doors so that it could be more easily identified, which they agreed to do. But the problem was they put coloured stickers on, but they were grey.
I suppose grey is technically speaking a colour, I suppose.
Well, yes. So there was that side of things. And then the interesting things in terms of the experience of the chamber. So Sarah Bull said, type 1 diabetic, she has to monitor her sugar levels, her glucose levels and blood and so on. And she has to have an iPhone app for that. She needs perhaps to moderate the situation with food and drink during the course of the day. Obviously, if you're sitting longer into the evenings, that can be problematic. And there's this whole question about how long do you have to sit in the chamber to get called, and this debate about whether or not there should be call lists or whether there are other ways in which members could know how long it is before they're going to get called, or do they just have to sit there for hours on end. And both she and Marie Tidball were saying, sitting 5-6 hours in the chamber waiting to be called is problematic.
And not especially comfortable or accessible seats for a start.
Yeah, they're uncomfortable even for able-bodied people. But if you have, for example, prosthetics, very, very difficult. Sarah Bull was saying she might need to go out to get food and drink. That can be problematic, and is it going to affect when she's going to be called? Interestingly, the degree to which provision is made, what we'd call in HR terms, reasonable accommodations are made for people's disability needs, access needs, seems to be quite ad hoc. It clearly has got better over the years, judging by what Robert Halfon's experience was, compared to what the new MPs have had in this Parliament, but still pretty ad hoc. And Sarah Bowles, for example, said that the officials have installed a small fridge in the Reasons room, that room we talked about some months ago on the podcast.
Just behind the Speaker's chair.
Yeah, where they go to sort of negotiate their explanations back to the House of Lords about why they're rejecting amendments. So there's this small room, and they've installed a fridge in there so she can put her insulin there, so she's got ready access to that in the evenings if she needs it. Things like that, clearly welcome, very, very useful, but somewhat ad hoc. And clearly, just things like being able to move about the palace unaided without always having to stop and ask for help and for support.
And someone to open a door for you or something like that.
Yeah. Marie Tidball was saying the longer they sit into the evenings, and sometimes, if that means you're getting a very late train home or a very late train back to the constituency, she needs help to move her bags. It's not just a question of her moving, it's also her sort of luggage, her laptop or whatever it may be. So she has to have staff support. So not knowing when the House is going to finish and uncertainty about timings doesn't just affect her, it affects staff. So it's a lot of issues, and clearly some of this can be done. Robert Halfon was keen to stress this. A lot of changes can be made. It's not just a question of money. It doesn't need huge investment necessarily, but it does need a change of culture and a change of attitude, and also a sort of a willingness to think more strategically and structurally about some of these issues. So it'd be interesting to see what the committee concludes, but I think a big issue is going to be the nature of the parliamentary timetable, and can changes be made to that and adjustments made to that, maybe slightly different sitting times or breaks in sitting times. It did occur to me that what the House of Lords does might be worth considering. So they have a concept of a 1 hour dinner break business,
they have
a question for short debate, which interrupts other business.
It's a mini debate sandwiched between two longer debates, and it does allow people a chance to sort of get out and move about a bit, and if necessary, take a bit of a break. The dinner break business, it's sometimes referred.
I don't think I'd recommend the House call it that, but I'm sure we can come up with some better language. But, if you're in a second reading debate or, whatever it may be, you don't necessarily have 5-6 hours, that you might have a couple of hours and then a break and something else intervenes screens, and
maybe
then move
the
on to something
chair,
else.
maybe the occupant of the chair can just be aware that certain people might have to nip out for a minute to get a insulin or whatever it might be, and not, as it were, penalise them afterwards and call them later because they've dared to leave the chamber for a second.
Yeah, I mean, it must be difficult for the speaker to keep track of all of this and manage in the chamber. So yeah, I need to sort of think about creatively about that. Pretty clear, I think, that Lucy Powell is quite interested in and quite supportive of the concept of call lists. So interesting to see how that debate develops.
I mean, I can see the case for call lists, but what I really wouldn't like is to get into the position that you get in the US Congress, where people are basically only there to deliver their own speeches and then they disappear, and there's no response between speeches. No more, it's a great pleasure to follow the honourable gentleman, but I disagree with his main argument, because you've just got a pre-written speech that you're going to dispense. Those kind of things need to happen in a proper debate, if a debate is going to be an actual debate rather than simply a list of sort of pre-packed contributions that are unfolded in the chamber.
Well, talking of contributions in the chamber in the US context, you will have heard that Senator Cory Booker in the United States has delivered the longest speech on record in the US Senate. So should we take a break, Mark, and come back and discuss that? Just before we go, I'll make my usual appeal to listeners to review us on your podcast app, whether that's Spotify, Apple, or whatever else you use. It really helps other listeners find us. So 5-star reviews would be...
But be warned, anyone who says anything nasty about us will have Her Majesty's Constabulary round on you.
And you won't be protected by parliamentary privilege. So listeners, do help us with that, and we'll see you in a moment.
And we're back, Ruth, and exciting times in the US Senate, if they use the word exciting in a particular context here. Cory Booker, one of the fairly long-serving Democrat senators, made a 25-hour speech. I'm not quite sure how you do that. Do you get comfort breaks? Do you get the chance for food to be brought out to you? No, none of that. So you just have to stand there and conduct a marathon. And this was all in the cause of offering some token parliamentary resistance to Donald Trump's agenda.
Yeah, I mean, it was interesting. 25 hours, broke Senate record for the longest speech ever in the US Senate.
The previous longest one was Strom Thurmond, the segregationist from, I think, South Carolina.
Yeah, 1957, when he spoke against civil rights legislation. So there was
nice man.
Yes, no, not, listeners. So there was kind of a symbolism to the fact that Cory Booker, who is a black Democratic representative from New Jersey, was sort of obliterating his record. And he very clear that was partly his intention as well. He wanted that record. But yes, it was a speech about, he described it as it's a moral moment. And he said his constituents were concerned about what was happening with Donald Trump and basically wanted him to do something different. And I think one of the concerns in the US in the Democratic Party is the absence of leadership, the absence of clear voices in response to what the Republicans are doing. So he decided that one way was to essentially take over the Senate floor and deliver this speech. And it was interesting, afterwards he explained how he'd prepared for it, which is pretty extraordinary. So in order to maintain the floor, he couldn't have food, couldn't go away and get food. He had a couple of glasses of water, that's all. He stood all the way through, couldn't sit down.
Yes, he was leaning, I think, on a lectern at one point, which apparently is permissible.
Yeah, so to prepare for this, he had basically dehydrated himself for 24 hours beforehand. Couldn't go for a comfort break, couldn't go to the toilet. So dehydrated himself for 24 hours beforehand, hadn't eaten for several days.
Wow.
Said afterwards to journalists, my apologies to the Senate doctor and my own doctor. I hope they're not too annoyed with me.
Well, I suppose you could think of this as the senatorial diet, because I'm sure you must lose a fair amount of weight by doing all that.
Yeah. But one thing that could be done is that other senators could intervene to ask a question, and he could yield the floor to them but retain the right to speak. So interestingly, he had a bit of paper on which he'd written the words explicitly that he had to say to maintain the floor. Otherwise, it would have given leave for the Republicans to have interrupted. So there was a lineup of Democratic senators realising what he was doing, had sort of piled into the chamber to support him and to intervene at appropriate moments.
In the Commons context, this is known as in-flight refuelling, where someone is making a long speech, someone can intervene just to give you a moment's relief to sit down or whatever.
Yeah. Question that was asked was, a lot of Republicans were saying, oh, it's just an absolute waste of time. I mean, this wasn't a formal filibuster because he wasn't stopping legislation, he wasn't stopping motions or a budget or anything like that. So it wasn't classed as a formal filibuster. But there was a question, is it a good use of time? Well, it went viral. I mean, millions were watching. I mean, I stayed up to watch that sort of last half hour to see if he blew through Strom Thurmond's record and was quietly cheering him on as I was watching C-SPAN.
Oh, the joy of C-SPAN. Yeah.
It was that sort of moment of, he'd captured attention. And
that, I think, was surely the point.
Yeah.
I mean, at the moment, there's a lot of criticism that the actual Democrat leadership in the US Senate has been pretty limp in its opposition to Donald Trump. Chuck Schumer, the leader there, is in some sense didn't fight over passing the US budget in a way that he might have done, and he came under huge criticism for that. And into that vacuum, I suspect, moves Cory Booker. There are people who will want to assert leadership over the Democrat Party, not perhaps formal leadership of their party group or anything like that.
Positioning.
But it's positioning. Does this tee him up as the presumptive front-runner for the Democrat presidential nomination? It's a long way out, but it's a start.
Yeah. Well, you did wonder what Charles Schumer thought about it, because publicly he was very supportive and saying very nice things and intervening to help, but I did wonder privately behind the scenes, was he thrilled?
Well, always remember the political maxim from Yes Minister: in order to stab someone in the back, you first have to get behind them. One of my favourites. But I suppose the question arises, and this kind of thing doesn't happen in Westminster and probably couldn't happen in Westminster. There's no way you can see a 25-hour speech being made in either House of Parliament on pretty much any occasion.
No, I mean, first of all, in terms of the sort of the agenda and the programme, you have the moment of interruption, you have programming and so on. One of the criticisms, of course, is that too often the speeches that MPs the time that they're given to speak is too short. We talked about it on the podcast
2 or
quite
3
a bit.
minute increments,
Yeah,
if you're lucky. And the moment of interruption, incidentally, is the formal sort of stop point at which main Commons business ends, and there's then an adjournment debate for half an hour. So you can't go on beyond that, and that's set in stone most of the time in Commons proceedings, unless there's a thing called an any hours motion passed. And in that case, again, the chair is rigorously monitoring how long MPs are allowed to speak. So in the Commons, the only occasion when you can really get a longer than usual speech is on private members' Bill Fridays. And even there, you've still got the moment of interruption looming. 2:30 will come along and that's it. But I still have post-traumatic memories of watching people like Philip Davis and Andrew Dismore and David Nuttall of blessed memory trying to talk out unwelcome private members' bills. I once got into trouble with Philip Davis for writing a Yesterday in Parliament which included the words "on and on he droned," and he was quite upset by this, but I felt it was fairly accurate reporting, to be honest.
Oh dear. Well, another issue, Mark, has come up here about how elected members use their time. So the criticism of Cory Booker was, standing in the Senate chamber, droning on.
But possibly doing a good piece of political positioning while he did it.
And also political education, I think, in his case, because he's got a message out there about all the problems that are happening now and what might happen in the future, and that is on record. But here, different question about how MPs use their times come up when 20 MPs have signed a letter to the Prime Minister of Pakistan calling on him to sort out an issue in Kashmir in relation to an airport development in the city of Mirpur. Basically, the MPs calling on the Pakistani authorities to build this airport, which is kind of interesting when quite a number of those signatories to the letter are opposed to development of airports in the UK for climate change reasons.
Yeah, well, if you're against airports for climate change reasons, you're presumably against them whether they're in Mirpur or in Heathrow.
We could hope so.
So there is something of an inconsistency there. And I do think that there is a kind of political opening that's been provided here where they may find people campaigning against them on the basis that they seem more concerned with airports in Kashmir than they are with conditions in their constituency. Now, that's a bit of a travesty. I mean, it takes an MP about 30 seconds to sign a letter.
Of course it does.
So, and I imagine they sign several dozen a day.
But it's about political and policy consistency, isn't it?
Yeah.
And whether you should be lobbying a foreign prime minister to do something that you're not willing to ask of your own prime minister for your own constituents. You're willing to ask it of an overseas prime minister for your constituents who happen to go back to that country as sort of part of the diaspora community, go back to visit and don't like the fact they've got to travel several hours to get back to their relatives from the airport that they can land in at the moment. They'd like somewhere nearer.
It's of course a very large Kashmiri diaspora in Britain, and Kashmiri-derived voters, if you like, are possibly swing voters in quite a number of constituencies now. And of course, Labour's relationship with a lot of Muslim voters has been very fraught because of the Gaza situation.
Yeah.
I suppose this is one way in which they can kind of keep in touch with some of those voters.
Yeah, but I go back to the point, it's about consistency of message and consistency of politics. And I mean, this is a delicate question in the Labour Party and Labour politics, but there is this concern about development of sectarian politics, within particular constituencies. And this kind of thing doesn't help, and it just makes you look a bit, frankly, hypocritical.
It's a difficult area to go blundering into for all sorts of reasons. And while some people can sort of shrug and say consistency is overrated in politics, I think a little bit of it every now and then might be quite welcome.
Useful. Well, Mark, with that, I think that's probably all we've got time for this week. We will have our next episode looking at the assisted dying bill, next in our series of special mini-pods, looking at the next stage, the report stage, which will be coming up on the 25th of April. So we've got our procedural guru, Mr. Paul Evans, back to explain what to look out for at report stage and third reading.
The secrets of report stage, always an interesting area to dive into.
So we're going to hold that over because parliamentary recess is kicking in this week in the House of Lords, and the Commons are back for a couple of days next week. But we'll be putting that special episode out next Thursday, so look out for that in your podcast feed. And then the following week, just before Easter, we've got one of your special Whipping Yarns episodes, Mark.
A special treat. The former Chief Whip under Rishi Sunak, Simon Hart, has written a tell-all memoir, or tell quite a lot memoir. One suspects there are a few secrets he didn't reveal in that book. And he's spoken to us about his experience as the ringmaster of Conservative MPs in the dying days of Rishi Sunak's government after a long era of Conservative rule. And it's quite a tale.
It is. And then we'll be back after Easter for that assisted dying bill report stage. So we won't actually be recording on the Thursday as normal. We'll be recording on the Friday, the 25th. So that will drop into your podcast feed on the Saturday morning. So we're delaying proceedings in order so that we can watch and report back on what happens with that important bill.
Do join us then.
And we'll see you then. Have a good break. Happy Easter. And we'll see you back on the 26th.
Bye-bye.
Parliament Matters is produced by the Hansard Society and supported by the Joseph Rowntree Charitable Trust. For more information, visit hansardsociety.org.uk/pm or find us on social media at Hansard Society.